Well, good morning, my excellent friends. Okay, before I get going here, I need to say something because Pastor Pete asked me to say something, okay? He talked to you guys last week about reconciliation, okay? And what I need to convey to you guys is that reconciliation is a two-way street, okay? So if you have done everything that you can to try and be reconciled to someone, and they decide not to be reconciled to you, that is up to them. If you have done everything that you can possibly do, you're good. Okay, you can take the cup, you can take the bread. It's not something you need to worry about. You can't force someone to be reconciled to you. You can just try your best and leave it up to them and leave it up to God. That's all you can do. But if you've done that, you're good. I hope that clears things up because I know a lot of you took what Pete said really seriously last week. And so I hope that clears things up and maybe makes you feel a little bit better. That you're not having to try and force someone to be reconciled to you. Okay? But how are my brothers and sisters doing this morning? Yeah, you're a little sleepy, I can tell. I'm a little sleepy. Okay? We've got a very important message to dive into this morning. So if you would, please turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter 27, and we're going to start at verse 1, just like Stephanie did. We're going to go a little further than she did. And as you're doing that, I just want to encourage all of you to pay attention this morning as we dissect the text here before us. Because as we have been following the story of David for the past few passages, the past few weeks, okay, what we have seen is the effect that encouragement can have on a person's life. But this week, we're going to see the opposite of that. Okay? We are going to see that discouragement can be debilitating and dangerous, even in the life of the man after God's own heart, David. And I'm going to tell you right off the bat here, I'm going to get real right here, okay, right off the bat, because I know that some of you, maybe a lot of you, I don't know, are feeling discouraged in your life right now. Circumstances are weighing heavy on you, and you're struggling just to get from one day to the next. And so, what I want to be this morning is an encourager for all of you. Okay? I want you to know that you are not alone. And even more so than that, what I want to be this morning is I also want to be a warning sign about the danger that something like, just something like feeling worn down or frustrated or discouraged can be. This message here this morning is particularly for you guys that are feeling worn down or discouraged, okay? Because as we will see in the text, that discouragement can be a foothold that Satan can use to try and get at you. Okay? And I love you, and I don't want to see that happen. But if that isn't you this morning, you're not feeling discouraged, your life is all sunshine and rainbows right now. Okay? If that isn't you this morning, that doesn't mean you get to fall asleep during class. Okay? Because if you're not in that state of discouragement this morning, I can firstly guarantee that probably one day you will be. Okay? And on top of that, what we will also see once again is the importance that encouragers need to play in everybody's lives. And all of us should be seeking to be those sources of encouragement. Okay? So with that said, let's dive in, shall we? Okay, verse 1 says, "But David thought to himself, one of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hand." Okay, so David is frustrated. He is at his wit's end. And honestly, I can understand why. Okay? Let's just for a second put ourselves in David's shoes right here. Okay? You have been on the run for who knows how long. You have been, your family, your men, their families have been hiding in the wilderness to escape the clutches of the king who is bent on killing you. You don't know what the next day is going to bring, whether peace or having to run for your life again. You don't know how you are going to provide for all of these people that are in your keeping. You can't go home. You can't trust anyone around you because you have just been betrayed for the second time by the Ziphites. You've just spared Saul's life for the second time after he has tried to kill you for the umpteenth time. He has just given you some empty words, trying to lure you back into his presence. And even before that, when he gave you words that seemed like they were heartfelt, it wasn't long before he went back on them. David's life, I can understand why he's at his wit's end right now. His everyday life is full of danger, intrigue, burdens, and immense responsibility. Just think about that. Put yourself in his shoes. Just that alone would wear us down. Okay? But worse than that, things never seem like they're improving. The situation is not getting better. And so, in his frustration, David reasons that the best thing that he can do is flee to Philistine territory. Okay, and we'll get back to that in just one second, but look at what just happened. In the chapter last week, David once again resisted the temptation that was presented before him to kill the king. Saul was delivered to him on a silver platter. But instead of striking out and killing him, he acted in obedience and trust in God and refused to lay a hand on Saul. But it's in that moment, right after the moment of great faith on David's part, that frustration and disobedience grab a hold of him. And that should strike us as odd. Wait a minute. David just did the right thing. He should be flying high right now, shouldn't he? He should be so pleased with himself and with his faithfulness and following God that nothing should be able to touch him right now, right? See, we often hear the importance of protecting ourselves and steeling ourselves against things that would hinder us from moving forward in following God. But we don't hear very often warnings of the temptation that is waiting on the other side of obedience. Temptation will be waiting on the other side of obedience. David has just had a mountaintop moment. He was presented with the opportunity to disobey God, to not trust God, and to take the throne for himself. And he resisted that temptation. Go, David. But just as that moment passes, here comes fear and discouragement and frustration to push David off the top of the mountain and send him hurtling down the slope. And we'll see that David falls pretty darn far. So we as followers of God need to be aware, yes, of the temptations that the enemy will throw at us to block our journey in following God. But we also need to be aware that once we overcome that obstacle, once we've made the right decision and continue in our faith to follow God, the enemy will not stop his attempts to get us off the path. We need to be aware that more temptation will follow success. So don't let your guard down, or else you will go tumbling down David. But just for a second, look at the text. Look at where this temptation to stray from God, the discouragement that leads David away, is coming from. Okay? David thought to himself. It comes from David, his own intrusive thoughts. This isn't some malevolent guy with a pitchfork and a pointy tail coming to David and pointing out the fact that things don't seem to be improving. No, this is David's own thoughts. And notice how David is not sharing his thoughts with those around him. He reasons in his own mind without seeking any counsel. And we need to stop right here again and recognize how much trouble we can get ourselves into when we fail to seek counsel from those faithful people that God has placed around us and internalize our struggle. God has placed people in David's life that have been vitally important in helping him serve God faithfully. Okay? He has his encouragers, Gad and Abiathar, right there with him. But he doesn't go to them and talk to them about his problems. He has his new wife, Abigail, who, while problematic that he married her, has just recently saved him from killing a man in cold blood. But he doesn't seek her counsel either. When we face struggles in our lives, it is vital that we talk to godly people around us, that we seek the counsel of the saints to help us in our tribulation and to guide us away from the trap that the discouragement brought on by those trials spring on us. It's one of the main purposes that we have spiritual growth groups here. Now, yes, we are doing a series of apologetics in those groups, but one of the main reasons those groups exist is so that we can surround ourselves with brothers and sisters who are seeking to follow God along with us and to be able to share with them concerns that we have in our lives. Okay? It happened just this past week in one of my groups. Okay? A person in the group had a question about a concern in their life and asked the group for help with it. And it was a wonderful discussion. And I think everybody in the group benefited from it. And on top of that, we helped that person with something they were struggling with. That is the purpose of those groups. Okay, now, Pete and I can't rely on you guys to constantly bring things to the group. So yes, we prepare lessons. Okay, that'll help you in applying God's word in your walk with him. Okay, but those groups exist so that what has happened to David doesn't happen to you guys. It was funny because when the person that brought the concern to the group started, they started by saying, "Can I ask a question that has nothing to do with the lesson that we're talking about?" Yes. Okay, absolutely yes. Okay, if you are struggling with something, do not keep it to yourself like David does here. Seek the counsel of your brothers and sisters in your discouragement, in your frustration and confusion. The way of the fool seems wise to them, but the wise listen to advice. Okay, don't be a fool like David. Seek the counsel of the godly. And very quickly, I just want to also emphasize the importance of being a person that a brother and sister can come to vent to. It's amazingly important. Okay? We've talked over the past few weeks about the importance of being encouragers in each other's lives. And here we can see the supreme value of it. If we aren't that for others, they may sink into the quicksand that discouragement and fear can bring. Do not underestimate the impact that a phone call or a text message or just going to get a cup of coffee with somebody can have on the life of someone who is struggling with doubt, fear, and discouragement. But I also want to emphasize the importance of us as encouragers not to become weary. I'm sure all of you know the person who constantly wants to vent and complain about the same thing. You all have a person in your mind, I'm sure. Okay? And the natural inclination that we have is to get frustrated with that person and that person's frustrations, right? I've already given you advice on this topic. How many times do I have to give it to you? Okay? Why won't you just listen to my advice? Okay? But that can't be our attitude. At least not if we're seeking to be more and more like God. How many times have you said to yourself, after having done something, I am never going to do that again? Only to find yourself doing what? Exactly that same thing again, right? Okay, but here is the good news. God does not lose patience with you in that sin. He doesn't say, come on, Rhonda. We've talked about this how many times before? You know that what you're doing is wrong. No, he doesn't do that. He listens and he gives grace and mercy. Brothers and sisters, be like God. Do not grow weary in the counseling of others. If you have comforted them in regards to a particular discouragement 1,000,000 times, and they come to you once again, seeking comfort in that discouragement again, comfort them for the 1,000,001st time. Do not let frustration allow you to abandon another in their frustration. For if you do, they may go down the path of David, here in this text, and refuse to seek counsel from their brothers and sisters. But more so than not seeking the counsel of godly people, okay, David is not seeking the counsel of God here. There is no prayer. There is no psalm that we can find where David expresses his concerns to God about this point in his life. He reasons in his own mind, and that's it. He doesn't seek God in this at all. And we need to learn from that too. If you are frustrated, if you are discouraged, talk to God. Lay out your frustration before him. Express your hopelessness to him. Now, why? Why should we do that? Why should we bring our concerns to God in that way? Why do we see so many times in the Bible people expressing their grievances, their defeat before God? Why are there so many instances where we see the psalmist, sometimes even David, crying out to God in hurt and distress? Because very often when we talk to God, when we cry out to him and say, God, help me, I'm hurting, I'm lost, very often there is a change. How many of us here can testify to that? How many of us can tell a story, okay, of a time in our lives when we were desperate, when we were discouraged, and we cried out to God, and as we laid out our hearts before him, a peace suddenly came upon us. A change occurred. Now, I've told you this story before, and many of you know that several years back, Pete, Dontel, and I came very close to becoming Christian recording artists. And after it fell apart, I was very angry at God. Okay, for a long while, actually. Okay, but eventually, I came to the realization that God's plan for my life was better than mine. Okay, but that realization, that change occurred one morning when I was driving to work. And I was crying out to God. Honestly, for the first time in a long time. Okay, I hadn't prayed for several months when that moment occurred. And all of a sudden, I had a realization of why God did what he did. A change occurred. And peace flooded my soul. Okay, that is the power that talking to God has. When we lay our burdens before him, so often those burdens become lighter. And the discouragement that we felt from them goes away. Okay, think about the months of frustration, discouragement, and bitterness I could have saved myself if I had just sought God earlier. Okay, so don't be like me in that situation. Don't be like David here. When you feel discouraged, seek God. Because look at the effect that discouragement can have on a person's life. Even a man after God's own heart like David, he reasons to himself that one day he is going to be struck down by Saul. Really? What about what Samuel said about you being king? Okay. What about what Jonathan said about you being king? What about what God has promised you? Okay. What about what even Saul has said about you being king? What about all the times that God has miraculously saved you from Saul's hand? Hey, do you see the effect that discouragement and frustration can have? It gets into your head and causes you to even doubt things that are right in front of your face, screaming facts to the contrary of what you're thinking. The evidence is there for David to see, but his discouragement is acting like a blindfold to everything that God is making abundantly clear to him. And don't think that doesn't happen to us too. When we feel the frustration, we so easily forget the promises that God has made to us and all the times that he has shown himself to be faithful. David reasons, despite all the evidence to the contrary, that Saul is going to eventually get him, so the best thing he can do is flee to the Philistines. Once again, really? The best thing you can do is go to the Philistines. I think I can probably think about a million better things that you could do than flee to the Philistines. Okay? But David's vision and his reasoning are clouded because of his discouragement. So much so that he goes to who? It says, so David and the 600 men with him left and went over to Achish, son of Maoch, king of Gath. David and his men settled in Gath with Achish. Each man had his family with him, and David had his two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, the widow of Nabal. When Saul was told that David had fled Gath, he no longer searched for him. So he flees to Achish. Okay, now Pete said this to you last week, are you having a sense of deja vu? Hey, be careful, that means they changed something in the Matrix. Okay? But this should sound familiar, because this is the same Achish that David fled to before. Now, do we remember that? Remember when he walked into Goliath's hometown with Goliath's sword over his shoulder? That's what we're talking about here, okay? And what did David end up doing when he did this before? Remember? Yeah, he ended up acting like a madman in front of Achish, okay? Degrading himself, allowing spit and snot to seep down into his beard and acting like he was insane. Why in the world would David flee to a place that made him act like that? And pay attention here, because I don't want you to miss it, because this is what fear and discouragement can lead us to. David is discouraged because he has followed God. He has refused to lay his hand on God's anointed, and despite his refusal to give into temptation, nothing has improved. And so in his frustration, in not seeing or receiving what he hoped he would from his obedience, he flees to a place that caused him to act insane. And how often does that happen to us? We serve God. We do what he tells us in his word to do in order to follow him, and yet we don't see any improvement in the situations that we're facing. So what do? We do exactly what David does. We flee for the protection of God's word, and we seek some kind of respite from the problems we face somewhere else. And let me tell you, this is going to sound weird coming from your pastor, there is relief that can be found in sin. Okay, sin has a pleasurable aspect to it. If it didn't, we would never be tempted to do it. But the problem is, the relief that sin can provide is only temporary, and it has consequences that follow after. But discouragement blinds us to that. It gives us this truncated vision so that all we see is the immediate relief that we might get from leaving God's word. And that's David's focus here. Okay? If I go over to the Philistine territory, it will stop Saul from pursuing me. That's what he's saying to himself. In fact, I bet he reasoned that it would only have to be a short stay in Philistia. Just long enough to let Saul give up the chase and we'll come back. But unfortunately, it doesn't work out that way. And far too often, that's how it works out for us. We entertain the idea of embracing sin, embracing departing from God's plan for us, as he divulges it in his word, just long enough to get some kind of relief from the situation we're in. But more often than not, it doesn't work out that way. And we end up staying in that sin for way longer than we originally planned, just like David. Verse 5 says, Then David said to Achish, If I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be assigned to me in one of the country towns, and I may live there. Why should your servant live in the royal city with you? So on that day, Achish gave him Ziklag, and it has belonged to the kings of Judah ever since. David lived in Philistine territory a year and 4 months. A year and 4 months. That is not a short period of time. I'm sure that is not what David intended when he first left Israel. But don't miss this. It isn't just David who has gone to Philistia. His family, his men, all their families, they're there too. So David's choice to seek a little break from the problems he's facing has led well over 600 people to stay in enemy land for over a year. Okay, this is important for us to see. Our response to discouragement affects those we care about too. It does not only affect us, but everyone around us. So guard yourself against the sin that is encouraged by discouragement. I know that's weird to hear. Discouragement encourages things. Okay, it encourages you to sin. Guard yourself against it, because it will impact more than you can know. And David stays so long, and he gains favor in Achish's eyes so much that he's given a town to live in. But the effects of David's choices here are not done yet. You may think that he has finally stopped tumbling down the mountain, but wait, there's more. Now, David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. From ancient times, these peoples had lived in the land extending to Shur and Egypt. Whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or a woman alive, but took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels and clothes. Then he returned to Achish. When Achish asked, "Where did you go raiding today?" David would say, "Against the Negev of Judah, or against the Negev of Jeremiel, or against the Negev of the Kenites." He did not leave a man or woman alive to be brought to Gath, for he thought they might inform on us and say, "This is what David did." And such was his practice as long as he lived in Philistine territory. Achish trusted David and said to himself, "He has become so obnoxious to his own people, the Israelites, that he will be my servant for life." So David and his men begin to raid the surrounding countryside in Philistia. He raids certain tribes of people who are remnants of those that the Israelites neglected to drive out completely when they took over the Promised Land. However, there is a problem, because all of these people are now subjects to Achish and the Philistines. So David raids these groups and leaves no one alive to tell the stories, like the Black Pearl. He takes all their livestock and their belongings, and then he comes back to Achish, and Achish naturally sees all the stuff that David has just gotten, and he's like, dude, where'd you get all this stuff? So David lies. Yeah, David outright lies. Okay, I hope you can see here how one sin can lead to another. David has sinned by allowing his discouragement and his frustration to allow him to seek relief somewhere other than God's protection. And it has led him to slaughter now countless lives. Now, I understand that these people are the enemies of Israel. Okay? And trust me, I have read so many commentaries trying to argue that David is trying to do a righteous thing here in defeating God's enemies. Okay? But we are given no indication that David sought God's guidance in this whatsoever. In fact, we are in a very dark time in David's life here. Okay, one of his lowest points. Now, I will concede that perhaps David tried to justify in his own mind that what he was doing was righteous, like many biblical scholars have done for him. But do not mistake it. David is acting out of his own volition here, not under God's direction. In fact, how did David get into this mess in the first place? Okay. He reasoned in his own mind, remember? And here we see once again the danger of that. In fact, it will come back to bite him in the future. And on top of all that, he's living a lie. It says, such was his practice as long as he lived in Philistine territory. That's not just talking about the raiding. That's talking about the lying. He is having to constantly lie to Achish to avoid any kind of retribution. Look at where giving up and giving into discouragement can get you. But wait, it isn't over yet. There's still more. It says, in those days, the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel. Achish said to David, you must understand that you and your men will accompany me in the army. David said, then you will see for yourself what your servant can do. Achish replied, very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life. So the Philistines decide they are going to war against Israel. And since David's lie has convinced Achish that David's allegiances lie with him, not to his homeland, Achish demands that David join them in fighting against Israel. And just so we are clear, this is a demand. This is not a suggestion like, hey, it would be real nice if you guys would join us. This is not, oh, gee, come and join us, please, David. This is a royal decree. David, you are coming with me to fight against your own people. And David agrees. Now, yes, he's most likely lying once again to Achish. Okay? But don't miss this. What we have just seen here is that David's actions in his frustration have now put him at odds against the very man that he has now sworn many times now never to harm, Saul. He either fights against his own people and obeys the king of the Philistines, forcing him to do what we have seen him swear never to do, or he refuses to do that, and he and all the people he's in charge of will face the wrath of Achish. Oh, what a tangled web we weave. You see, discouragement and frustration are cancer. If you let them grow, they will consume you and cause you down a path away from God. And too often they come in the wake of obedience. We faithfully do what God has called us to do, only to not see the results from that obedience that we're hoping for. And so we seek that result that we were hoping for in our own way. And it leads us to disobedience, which then leads us to more disobedience and more disobedience, sometimes even under the disguise of righteousness. And all of that splatters out on those that are around us. So how do we avoid this? How can we prevent discouragement from destroying us? Talk to those around you. Don't be like David in this passage, holding it all inside and refusing to find help. Seek godly brothers and sisters. Tell them about your burdens and listen to their advice. And more importantly, talk to God. Don't you think that the one who set the stars in place, who told the oceans where to start and where to end, who set time and space in motion, don't you think that the one who holds all of that in his hands is a safe and secure place for you to rest? Talk to him. Listen to him. Trust him. That's where David got himself in trouble in the first place. He thought in his own head, didn't share with anyone around him, or talk to God. And it led him down a horrible trail that we actually have not seen the end of yet. He's still falling down the mountain. How can we prevent ourselves from falling into the trap that discouragement can spring on us? Be an encourager. Be a place where others can come to voice their hurt and distress and confusion. Do not grow weary of helping others. Bear one another's burdens. And by this, you will fulfill the law in its entirety, by loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, by obeying his word, and by loving your neighbor as yourself. Lift others up and point them to God. Remember that only God can grant true rest. Sin may offer temporary relief, but it is fleeting. And the consequences of seeking it instead of God will splash out on everybody around you. Discouragement is dangerous. It can destroy from the inside out. Do not let it lead you astray. Trust that even though you may not understand God's plan at the moment, or why that trial is in your life, or why things never seem to improve, trust his plan is good because he is good. Let not your hearts be troubled. God is with you.